Welcome and thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Kaja Ram, and I'm a library assistant at the Millbury Library. Tonight I'll be in conversation with Bryant Terry about his newest book, Black Food: Stories, Art, and Recipes from Across the African Diaspora. And then we'll have a Q&A session. But first, next month, two amazing authors will be joining us. On Wednesday, April 20th, Christina Conklin will discuss the impact of climate change on global communities in her book, The Atlas of Disappearing Places. Then, on Wednesday, April 27th, Emily St. John Mandel, author of Station 11, which I happen to be watching right now, and a pretty good adaptation on HBO. They are not paying us. She will discuss her new book, Sea of Tranquility. Your microphone and video will be turned off, but please feel free to use the chat and submit your questions into the Zoom Q&A. For those who'd like to access live closed captions, click on the CC button and then click Show Subtitle so you can see those closed captions. Without further ado, San Mateo Libraries welcomes Bryant Terry, author of Afro-Vegan, Vegetable Kingdom, and his newest book, Black Food. This beautiful tome is available at fine bookstores everywhere. Black Food, Bryant is the chief in residence at the Museum of the African Diaspora right here in San Francisco, where he creates programming that celebrates the intersection of food, farming, health, activism, art, culture, and the African diaspora, much like this book. He is renowned for his activism and his efforts to create healthy, equitable, and sustainable food systems. His work has been featured in the New York Times, Washington Post, CBS This Morning, and NPR's All Things Considered. Bryant, I'm so glad to be here with you tonight to talk about this book.
Thank you. I appreciate the introduction, Kaja. And it's actually chef in residence, but I almost feel like we should change that to chief in residence. I think I like that even better.
Oh yeah, chief in residence sounds pretty good. Yeah, and it's a great, if anyone hasn't been to the museum, it's a pretty wonderful place. And you can actually get tickets to it through our Discover and Go feature. So take advantage of that if you can. So Bryant, I want to get right into it. I love this book. This is a collection of recipes, voices, essays, discussions about all sorts of Black voices that you've chose to feature. And I kind of want to discuss the process of developing a book like this. The books you've written before, they were you sharing your ideas, sharing your recipes, explaining some of your techniques. This is about featuring others as well as kind of featuring diasporic thinking in general. What were your goals when you started writing this, and how did they change? Did they change as you started to pick this book together and collaborate with different people?
Sure, that's a great first question. And first of all, I want to say that throughout the process of putting this book together, one thing that I emphasize with the whole team is that process is equally important to outcome. And a part of that for me is really about modeling the way in which books can be done differently. You know, I think in these kind of old industries, the way that things are done, the kind of internal logic of how things operate, they just kind of, they often aren't disrupted because people are just doing things the way that they're used to doing them. And I think there are a lot of inefficiencies in the way that books are often put together. I think there are a lot of things that are problematic that I just wanted to show as an author, as an editor of this book, the way in which we could kind of shift that. So in order to talk about the book, though, we need to go back to my residency at the Museum of the African Diaspora, and I'm glad you mentioned it. Back in 2015, Linda Harrison, the former executive director, approached me about creating this chef residency, and she really had this expansive vision of what a fine art museum could be in a city like San Francisco. As I'm sure everyone knows, San Francisco has been suffering from massive outmigration of African Americans over over the past several decades. I think the population just in the past like 20 years has gone from around 16% to maybe like 4 or 5% now, probably less at this point. You know, we know it's driven by the tech industry, gentrification, exorbitant housing prices. And Linda really understood that this space could play more of a role than just exhibiting fine art, and really be a space for community building, education, and just, you know, a space where Black folks could see, you know, just see it as their home, and as a place where they felt like safe and, you know, had the ability to connect and build community with others. So, you know, the first program that we did was actually it was called Black Women, Food and Power. And it was a panel discussion that I had with some brilliant scholars and some authors and activists. There was actually a farmer author, Gail Myers, who is an anthropologist as well as an activist and a poet. And I knew that we were onto something. I always say that I could tell that there was this literal hunger for this type of programming that dealt with, you know, public health and food and farming issues, because it didn't surprise me that people drove up from LA, or the fact that people flew down from the Pacific Northwest, but the fact that we had people who were flying in from the East Coast, New York City, New Jersey, Philadelphia, for a 2-hour program at our small but mighty museum in San Francisco. It just let me know that this is a big thing. And you know, just with the program, like literally we still get calls from around the world from institutions that aren't necessarily focused on food, but understand the importance of having more programming around food. So from the beginning, I was thinking, how can we bring this brilliant, magical programming to the world? But, you know, just kind of put it on the back burner. So fast forward to 2020, you know, we were looking at just the kind of racial reckoning that this country was facing in the, you know, post George Floyd and Breonna Taylor's murders. And there were just a lot of questions that people were asking about representation and erasure. And on the heels of that, I don't know if people are aware that there was a revelation of a lot of racism within food media itself. There were some food media companies that had been called out for their failure to protect and uplift and, you know, promote many of their employees of color. And so for me, what this said to me was, this was the moment that this book needed to come out, you know, and I really wanted to create space for the more than 100 contributors throughout the Black diaspora to be a part of this project. And I always jokingly say, you know, the funny, because we signed the contract in like July, and we put this book together in the pandemic. And I kind of jokingly always call it, you know, this is my pandemic baby. And then a friend of mine who's a doula, she actually, you know, just kind of brought up the fact that, yeah, you know, you put this book together in 9 months. That's literally the gestation period typically. And so this is truly my pandemic baby. But, you know, I just want to, for authors or for people who are budding authors or interested in the bookmaking process, I want to talk a little bit about just how I assembled this brilliant team. The first thing I did when we got word that we could do this book, or that 10 Speed was going to publish this book, my publisher. But let me say this. So I don't know if you noticed, but this book was published by Four Color Books, which is an imprint of 10 Speed Press. And it's actually my publishing imprint. So, you know, in addition to being an author, I'm now a publisher, because soon after getting the book deal, my agent and I approached the bigwigs at Pickled and Random House, and we made a pitch for me having my own publishing imprint. So this is our flagship publication. And then we've acquired about 6 books, you know, since then. So we could talk about that later if you like. But I just want to say that the first thing that I did, because I went into this very clear that I knew a lot. I knew what I knew, but I also knew that there was a lot that I just didn't know, or I had some blind spots. And so I assembled what I call my kitchen cabinet. And I called on 3 of my colleagues, some brilliant colleagues. One is a chef and a professor at NYU Food Studies program. One is a former executive director of the National Food Justice Alliance, and another is a storyteller and a chef. And I really wanted to have this brain trust to help me, you know, just keep me focused, help me stay accountable to the communities that I felt like I was writing this book for, to connect me to people that I might not know. I know a lot of folks, but they're people who, might be a colleague, but I don't necessarily have a relationship with them. And I would say that was one of the smartest things that I could have done early on, because this team allowed me to not feel like the weight of putting this book together was all on me. And, I know what I'm good at and I know what I'm not. And I am good at assembling a team and leading people to our goal, manifesting the goal that we had. Couple more minutes and I'll stop, because I can go on for hours about just the process of making this book. But I want to say that, it was clear to me that, I love my art director at 10 Speed Press, but I really thought it was important that for this book, we needed to have a Black art director and we need to have a Black designer. And we got, those both in San Francisco-based artist, George McCalman. And not just a Black one, but a Black art director and designer who understands Black visual language and aesthetics and history, and who could really connect with the content of this book in a spiritual way. And I would love to talk a little bit later about the, just kind of how we got to this brilliant cover that George designed. But, from George to our food photographer, Oriana Corin, to our food stylist, Jillian Knox, we had a mostly Black creative team who put this book together, save for our food stylist, Lillian Kang, who's Korean. And this is just a rarity. You rarely see a mostly Black cookbook team, because there's simply a paucity of Black people who are in the food space in these so-called below the line jobs, like food photographers and prop stylists and food stylists. So closing the circle, I just want to say, for us, the end product was important. And it was also very important that we showed our publisher and the world that you can do things differently. You can have a team that reflects the content and the, energy of the book. And I'm just so lucky that I was able to be the coach who helped us achieve this goal.
Thank you, Bryant. That actually kind of leads into a question I had for you. I'm skipping around here, but that kind of inspires this one. In Therese Nelson, in her essay Thursdays Off, she describes how being a Black food creative, it requires a complicated navigation. You have to honor Black foodways. You have to respect tradition and understand it, but you also have to have artistic integrity. You want to innovate, but you also want to keep it going. You want to make money. So you have to satisfy the appetites of capitalism. There's all this navigation. So do you have advice for up and coming people who are filling those roles, who are seeing that there's a need for that and who want to be those people? Do you have advice for how up and coming creatives, especially Black voices, can navigate this sort of like this difficult river of balancing all these spheres?
Yeah, it's a delicate balance. And the thing that has driven my work, in health, food, and farming issues for the past 2 decades is this West African concept, Sankofa, which, is symbolized by a bird that's walking forward, but looking backwards. And the whole, idea behind Sankofa is that as we move into the future, we should be looking to the past and, looking at the best practices and the traditions and the ideas and the things that our ancestors, that were part of the way that they lived, and the things that'll serve us best in the future, and bringing those with us. So, I've always, I think the thing about culture and traditions is they're ever shifting. And then I try to stay away from this idea of like cultural purity. I think there are a number of things that kind of, shift and disrupt traditions and move them to a different place. So for me, it's about respecting and being grounded in those traditions, but also, moving forward in a way that makes sense for a contemporary audience. I always say that everything that I have attempted to teach and kind of, share with people over the past 2 decades, I learned as a child in the backyard gardens of my grandparents. My paternal grandfather, Andrew, his backyard garden in Memphis, where I grew up, it was more than a garden. It was a urban farm. Every bit of available space was being used to grow some type of food. And he had a mini orchard, he had nut trees, and he was growing muscadine grapes. And, at one point he had chickens and a hog back there. And this is in the city. This was a working class Black neighborhood that he lived in. And then, across town in my maternal grandmother's house, learning from her side in the kitchen. And so I always say that I'm standing on the shoulders of these ancestors, who came before me, whether it's my, blood ancestors or these kind of intellectual or political, activist ancestors who've come before me. And so I always want to uplift them and respect them. But I also know that, the modern audience, people like, so many of the recipes that are seen as like traditional Black recipes, people have seen them a thousand times. And so what can I do to kind of innovate, repackage them in a way that, has the integrity, but that's fresh and new and exciting. And I just want to say, in that regard, just kind of going back to like process and putting this book together. So originally, this was actually the cover that we were imagining for the book. And this is kind of our play on European still lives. We call it Afro still life. And so, this is highlighting many of the staple ingredients that you see throughout the African diaspora. And so if you know my body of work, one of my signatures is I include a suggested soundtrack with every recipe because, why not? You eating, you want to hear music, cooking, music. So in this book, we have a full-on playlist. If I could find it. There's a recipe. So there's the full playlist, right? So we have the playlist in this book with all the songs divided by chapters. And when I was compiling the playlist before publication, I sent it to a few colleagues and I was just like, this is a playlist I have for the book. Can you just give me some feedback? I just want to know how you feel, like viscerally, when you hear this, when you look at the songs, like, how does it make you feel? And one of my closest friends and colleagues is another cookbook author. She, called me and she said, I love the playlist. It's amazing. I love all your playlists. But let me just say, this playlist makes sense for me and for people of our generation. But I don't feel like if my 20-something-year-old assistant looked at that playlist, that she would find herself in there, that she would, look at it and see, oh, yeah, these are some of my favorite artists, or these are some of the songs that I like. So that sent me on this journey where I started to do all this research about a lot of contemporary artists, because, this has like, jazz and some hip hop and just some stuff that makes sense to me. But it's like, who's making really compelling music now? So I started doing all this research and totally reworked the playlist. And it has like a nice peppering of a lot of like younger contemporary artists as well. And so what that process did is it really helped me rethink this as the cover, because what I realized is that this cover is just, it was very, if we use this as a cover, I felt like it would do what I kind of intended it to do, which was like a visual thesis statement. It would be great for helping to just kind of quickly help people imagine like what they might find, but it just was too academic. And so I actually went back to our designer, and our designer, George, he's like kind of hardcore, he's like, when he's working, it's like, he could be a little scary. I'll put it like that. And so I was so nervous. I was like, oh my God, George, I just got to talk to you. I really don't want that cover anymore. And I know you worked so hard on designing it, but can we try another cover? And so to wrap up, a few years before we did this book, I had met George at SF MoMA, and we had this great conversation. And I was like, what, George, I don't know what, but we're going to do something big. We're going to do some kind of creative collaboration. So then when I told him that I wanted him to be the art director, he did a quick mock-up of the cover. And this was the cover that he did. So it was like, he did this mock-up of the cover. We put it away, went on this whole circuitous route, all these other covers. And then like 7 months later, came right back to this cover. And I say, this is one of the most brilliant book covers that I've seen in a long time. I feel that way, even if it wasn't my book. So.
I mean, I was telling you earlier, I live in the city, and I walk every bookstore I walk by, it's in the storefront window. It calls right out to you. Everybody notices it. I've seen people notice it on the street. So I think that was probably a really good decision. And we have a few comments in the chat. Everybody's talking about how they love to play music while they cook. So I think it's not a bad idea to share some recommendations.
Well, let me just say this. If you all have Spotify, you can go to Spotify and type in Black food, and it should pull up the whole playlist.
Oh.
And then I actually had a fan who emailed and say, hey, I saw that you didn't have your playlist on YouTube, and I made the playlist for you. So I think you can actually type in Black food on YouTube as well, and it will pull up this playlist. So.
Yeah, Black food book playlist. Perfect. Okay. I'm gonna check that out a bit later. You know, it's interesting because you talk about, I've seen other interviews, you talk about being very collaborative, not trying to be too prescriptive in putting this book together. And we've been talking about process. And I was curious though, because you still have the editorial voice, you still have final say about what goes in there, right? I'm curious, what are your guiding principles? Or was there ever a point where you had to say, you know what, this is great, but it's not going to work in this book. Maybe we can save it a little later. When you had to make those hard decisions, what did you use? Did you go with your gut? Did you have a goal you were going for in the book? Like what inspired you, or what kept you sort of on the straight and narrow?
Well, with the recipes, I'll say one of the most challenging parts of creating this book early on was deciding if this would be a vegan cookbook. As you know, my body of work is, mostly vegan cookbooks. That's what I've been focusing on. And, I feel like, that's my wheelhouse. For this one, it was tough because I didn't want to be overly prescriptive about what recipes the chef contributors offered. One, I didn't want people to do something that was outside of their wheelhouse. If we had 3 years to put this book together, and then, I let people know, listen, I want this to be an all vegan cookbook. And I know you may not be an expert on vegan cooking, but you have some time. Why don't you test some recipes out, see what works, and then, you can bring it back. We had 9 months to put this book together, and I didn't want to give people an assignment that they wouldn't be able to fulfill. So just practically, that was one of the challenges. But then, as an editor, I had to take off my activist, my author hat, who believes that, who, to be clear, doesn't necessarily think that a vegan diet or a plant-based diet is, the perfect diet in terms of health and well-being. I can make arguments all day about why we all should embrace this way of eating for ethical reasons, for environmental reasons, for economic reasons. But I'm not the one that's going to say, oh, vegan diet is the healthiest diet in the world, because it's just more complicated. There is no perfect diet. But I guess the point is that I really thought that it was most important that the contributors bring their most authentic story to this book, their most authentic way of connecting with food. And if that meant that, Hawa Hassan, who is a Somali and American chef, she felt strongly that, the Somali lamb stew is one of the staples of her family and the community in which she comes from. And that's what she wanted to offer that represented who she is. And so, I definitely was feeling like I don't want to disappoint my long-term fans, the people who've supported me over the years who expect the vegan recipes, but I also wanted to do what was best in service of the book. And it's been amazing. I love when I get messages or see, whatever on social media, on Twitter and Instagram and other social mediums. Look, I'm not, I'm a vegan and I'm not going to eat a lot of the animal products in here, but I understand the importance of this book and the stories that are being told. And, I think it's important for me to have it in my library. So that's been really cool.
Well, and to be fair, as a vegan, seeing some of those meat recipes, I can't deny they look pretty delicious, especially the way they were photographed. I'm not one of those who if they do a sort of vegan version where they get the texture right, I'm all for it. So it's kind of, at least as art, I was kind of like, it made me hungry. So it's interesting that you did include those in there, because I know your voice has been sort of a big one. A lot of vegans of all colors sort of discovered a different way of being vegan through a lot of your books. So yeah, I did kind of want to ask you about that. I'm glad you spoke about that. You know, a little bit ago, you also talked, it's so interesting because this is what I was curious about too. You talk about being in your grandparents' garden, garden in the backyard. And obviously, you're a Renaissance man. You're an activist. You're an author. You're a chef. You're a scholar. You're writing these ideas about history and the diaspora. But at the core of it, there's always food. And I kind of want to talk a little bit about how your encounters with food when you were younger developed and helped you also develop these other hats, your work as an activist, your work as an author, and how that initial relationship with food blossomed into this sort of body of work that you have today.
Well, let me just say this. I come from a musical family. My mom's dad, Edward Bryant, was a singer, and he had this group, Eddie Bryant and the Four Stars of Harmony. They were the first Black gospel group to perform on the radio in Memphis. You know, they would travel regionally. And because of his passion for music, all of my mom and all her siblings were you know, musicians in some way, from my mom, who sings in the church choir, to my Uncle Don, who's a really popular singer and songwriter in like the late 60s and 70s, who kind of like took a step back to, he was the songwriter, the house songwriter for High Records, which is one of the seminal soul music labels in Memphis. He stepped back to be the house songwriter and to pen a lot of the hits of my aunt, Ann Peebles, who has this big hit, I Can't Stand the Rain Against My Window Pane. And so I just grew up surrounded by music, and that's why it's so central to my work. And then there's this whole issue around, you know, me really understanding historically the way in which, you know, traditionally, so many of the things that have been so integral to the way that we, you know, grow and cook and eat, you know, music, art, culture, community, our industrialized food system, which has created, you know, food as this commodity over here, there's this huge chasm where all those other things are on some other side, art, culture, community. And I really try to just model how we can bridge those, you know, that gap and bring these things back together. But, you know, oh man, I'm trying to like share so many ideas. Kind of lost my train of thought.
Yeah, I mean, just about your development with food and
your
activism and your, but
so
yeah.
So I just want to say, in terms of my own, what catalyzed my interest in, I should say what kind of catalyzed my own, the shift in my habits and attitudes and politics regarding food. It was a song. When I was in high school, you know, I grew up eating, and I always uplift the practices of regular everyday people. You know, I'm happy that people, you know, see this region as kind of the epicenter of where the food movement, as we know it, you know, the kind of came out of the 1970s. Many people kind of trace it to my mentor, Alice Waters' work at Chez Panisse and a lot of her activism. And I just feel so lucky to be in this city where a lot of that movement started. And I think it's important for me to uplift just regular everyday people who've maintained these practices, working class people, working poor people in rural areas, in cities. And, you know, I just think about my own family. Like I always say, we ate as local as our backyard garden. It was always in season, and we would literally harvest food right before our meals. And when I travel the country, and I travel a lot, not as much as I did before I had kids, but sometimes I would do up to 90 events per year. And I feel like there's almost this collective amnesia, you know, when I go to conferences, colleges, community events, and I'll be asking people like, how many of your families, you know, had farms in rural areas? How many of your families had kitchen gardens? How many of your families canned and pickled and preserved? How many of your families, you know, made meals from scratch? And people are raising their hands, but it's almost like this kind of like, oh yeah, I forgot Meemaw used to be canning and pickling, and I forgot that we had that little garden in the neighborhood that everybody would contribute to. And so a big part of my work is about helping people kind of remember, piece back these histories that I think our industrialized food system has, you know, just made us forget about. But I'll say this. When I was in high school, I heard this hip hop song, and I know a lot of people, if you just like heard rap on the kind of corporate control media or, you know, the radio, then I get why you probably don't like it. But I grew up in this period called the golden age of hip hop, where so much of the hip hop was socially charged and politically conscious. And it really shaped a lot of my politics and my food politics, because I heard this song by this group Boogie Down Productions with their lead MC KRS-One. And this is the thing that changed everything for me. And I wanted to actually share the lyrics with you all because I think they're very powerful.
Please.
And it goes something like this: beef. I'm gonna get my microphone. Beef. What a relief. When will this poisonous product cease? This is another public service announcement. You can believe it or you can doubt it. Let us begin now with the cow, the way that it gets to your plate and how. The cow doesn't grow fast enough for man, so through his greed, he creates a faster plan. He has drugs to make the cow grow quicker. Through the stress, the cow gets sicker. 21 different drugs are pumped into the cow in one big lump, and just before it dies, it cries in the slaughterhouse full of germs and flies. And I'll stop there because it gets much more graphic. But, you know, I heard this song and I remember just like running to my dad because it was just, it just turned my world upside down. I asked my dad to give me the tape because we listened to tapes back in the, in the 90s. And then my dad encouraged me. Well, he said he wasn't going to give me the tape unless I first read this book, The Jungle, by this writer, the Upton Sinclair. And it's about the meatpacking industry in the Midwest in the early 20th century. And then he wanted me to write him a one-page essay because he's a tiger dad. But point is, it was a song and a book that shifted my habits and my attitudes and my politics regarding food. And so I'm always very aware of the different ways that people learn. And I know that, you know, there are a lot of educational and class biases when you're just leading with the heady intellectual ideas, when you're just talking about public policy. I've always thought about how can we widen the net or, you know, bring more people to the table. And I think these things like music and art and culture and beauty and recipes are such a powerful way to kind of ignite, you know, something in us that would, you know, really want us to be more involved in changing things. And that's really why I decided to write cookbooks.
You know, I would have been totally happy with like an NPR answer where you're like, my grandfather would stand out on and hold green beans up and the sun on the green beans would shine in the daily. But the fact that hip hop was what inspired you really to like think about food on a conscious level. I'm very, that's awesome. I'm so happy with that answer. You know, there's you know, like, that's a different type of, that's a culture maybe people aren't used to, who maybe your typical readers or, you know, the people who might visit the museum, maybe they, you know, that might not be something they normally listen to. And maybe now they want to listen to it. One of the things I found, the voices in your book, even among Black literature, they're voices that you don't see every day, even if you're watching quote unquote, like kind of Black channels of voices. They, you know, the passage I'm thinking of specifically that I absolutely adored. I loved most of the passages in the book, but the chapter I absolutely loved was Black queer food. It stands out beautifully to me because it connects different kinds of LGBTQ experiences to food, but also very interestingly to family and the idea not so much of tradition, but of being excluded from tradition and having to create family and how food's a part of that. So we often think about, you know, if we see your book, we're thinking about it in terms of a tradition, but this is also about found family and creating family. So can you talk a little bit about the process of putting together that chapter and like the reason, how did that come to be? Because it's a great chapter, a great section of the book.
Well, let me just say this. Many of the chapters in this book were literally lifted from programming that I did at the museum. So obviously I mentioned the Black Women, Food and Power chapter, the Land Liberation and Food Justice, the Black Queer Food chapter. These are inspired by programs that I did at the museum. And, you know, all panels where I brought together these brilliant people from around the country to talk about these issues and you know, the way in which the kind of lens to which they were thinking about food. And, you know, I have a lot of friends and colleagues in the food world who are queer and gender nonconforming, and they have often, you know, personally kind of, you know, privately talked to me about the intersection of race and you know, gender and sexuality, and how they have to move through the world in certain ways, and kind of the compound oppression that they often feel. And I just think that it was important for me to use my platform and power and position to uplift those voices and to give them the opportunity to talk about those experiences. You know, I've always had this perspective coming from, you know, just to be clear, a lot of people know me as a cookbook author or see me on TV or whatever, but my work around these issues started as a grassroots activist when I founded this organization in New York City called Be Healthy, which worked with young people from the lower economic strata to use cooking as a way to excite them to be involved in the food justice movement. And I've always felt that, you know, if we want to address many of the societal ills, we need to be, you know, fixing the problem or working with the most marginalized communities to help address the issues that they're dealing with. And when you do that, then it has like the trickle up effect, unlike the kind of like conservative trickle down effect, but this trickles up and everybody wins when you help those who are, you know, most at the margins. And I just have to say that, you know, the kind of erasure and marginalization that we know is present, you know, throughout this country when it comes to a lot of our queer brothers and sisters, I just felt like it was important for me to uplift their voices, both in the public forum at the museum and in the book. And I agree with you. I think that, you know, and if you listen to the soundtrack, the first song of that chapter, Black Queer Food, that I offer is this song by this artist, Blood Orange, and it's called Family. And so there is a kind of audio clip at the beginning of the activist and actress Janet Mock. And Janet Mock was talking about how, you know, family is not just our blood family to whom, you know, we were born, but it's also about creating, you know, these new kinship networks. It's about creating family and surrounding ourselves with those who see us, those who love us, those who support us, and that, you know, we should be, you know, reinventing what family means to ensure that we're safe, that we're seen. And I really felt like is one of my favorite chapters in the book, just hearing, you know, people just talk about the ways that, you know, they're kind of connecting with food and how they've been seen or not.
Oh, thank you, Bryant. I mean, you know, it's interesting. We're going to switch over to a Q&A soon, but I do want to ask you, because you're kind of talking about all these different like webs of connections and communities kind of sharing their wisdom with each other, right? Including, you know, Janet Mock, and her voice is becoming more present. You know, she had Pose, and there's that show on television. If you haven't seen it, it's great. I love it. But I also want to know, a lot of this is about diasporic consciousness, right? So I think a lot of people are familiar with that word, or maybe understand intellectually what it means. But before we switch to our Q&A, I kind of wanted to hear from you. What is it like to think with a diasporic consciousness in the everyday? What is it like when you're shopping at the store and you're picking food recipes, or when you're talking to people and hearing about where they come from? How does that consciousness affect how you perceive the everyday? I just kind of want to hear a little bit about that, because the book talks a lot about that consciousness.
Well, I'll say, I mean, I can talk about in general, but let me just talk in terms of food itself. As, you know, a Black man from the South, and, you know, being surrounded by what I would call Black food or African-American cuisine, I saw firsthand the diversity and complexity of this beautiful, you know, these beautiful food traditions. And I think for many people who did not grow up closely connected to those food traditions, there are these very reductive ways that, we often think about them. I think when people hear Black food in the popular imagination, people kind of like, soul food, I think is what people often hear, where they think, yeah, that's like what Black people eat, Black food, soul food, this kind of synonymous. And I'll tell you the way in which I found that, most people imagine kind of Black food, soul food, whatever you want to think about it. Either they're thinking about the kind of antebellum survival foods upon which many enslaved Africans had to rely, which, and there are these ways in which people talk about that in a very pejorative way. It's just like, oh, that's slave food, like Black food, why do I want to eat that? Or why should Black people be eating? I mean, and so this is not just the wider culture who often sees it that way, but even, people of African descent being like, that's slave food. I don't want to eat that stuff. And so one, I mean, it's historically inaccurate to just reduce it to that, because the institution of slavery certainly wasn't a monolith. It looked different. And, I mean, look, it's talking about North America, you're talking about the Caribbean, talking about Latin America. So, the way that enslaved Africans might cook and grow food and cook and eat would look different in the Black Belt of the South, like states like Mississippi and Tennessee and Arkansas, than it did in the coastal Carolinas, than it did in, Louisiana, than it did in the Caribbean, than it did in Latin America. And so just to reduce it to that doesn't account for the many factors that contribute to the different ways that enslaved Africans eat. And not to mention that every Black person in this country before after or during the antebellum period wasn't an enslaved person. There were free Blacks who had been to this in this country for a long time. So just reducing it to that it just doesn't understand that the financial disposition of the plantation owner, the geographic location, and all these other factors contributed to it. But the other way that people think about it are the kind of big flavored meats and the overcooked vegetables and the sugary desserts that one might find at a soul food restaurant, right? Mm-hmm. And so I'm not denying that either of those strains are part of this larger, more complex foodways. Yes, things like, the animal innards or chitlins, as they're referred, or pig's feet, or, whatever kind of things we imagine is just like the worst parts of the animal or the vegetables that the plantation owners would discard and, give to the enslaved Africans. I'm not saying that red velvet cake and ribs and, all these macaroni and cheese, that's a part of it too. But what about the collards, the mustards, the turnips, the kale, the dandelions, the sugar snap peas, the pole beans, the black-eyed peas, the sweet potatoes, the muscadine grapes, all these foods that my grandparents and many other people in their community grew, that I think any Western trained allopathic physician or dietitian or nutritionist would say we should all be eating. These are the foundational foods of Black cuisine. So I think that needs to be said, but also when we talk about Black food, you can't talk about it without seeing it as a diasporic cuisine. I always talk about it as like the original modern global fusion cuisine. When you think about the food traditions, the flavor profiles, the classic dishes and the staple ingredients that traveled from West and Central Africa to the Caribbean and intermingled with the indigenous foods of this land and the influence of European foodways and cooking techniques and ingredients and all that. And so whenever I think about Black food, I'm thinking about the diaspora. I'm thinking about okra as a food that's indigenous to, West Africa. I'm thinking about, all these staples that we may not realize, have this connection to the continent or other parts of the diaspora. And I just want people to celebrate them and uplift them and really understand just all these ways in which, people in Brazil, people in, Jamaica, people in, Louisiana, there's some deep connections. And I think food is such a powerful way to really illuminate those.
Yeah, and that's a perfect segue into this question by Naya Patel. Naya says, my mom grew up in South Africa during apartheid, and my father was brought up in Zambia. Are there recipes from different regions of Africa also included in your book? And what is your personal favorite dish in the book?
Oh my gosh. Yes, there are essays, there are recipes that span the African continent and, wherever people have traveled. I will say that, and this is, it's interesting because this isn't necessarily like African in, the most obvious way, but there's a chapter Black Future, which, really kind of forces us to think about, well, what does the future of Black food look like? And I always, to be clear, while earlier I was mentioning that, there is no perfect diet, and I'd never be one to be like, well, vegan food is being a vegan is the perfect lifestyle and diet for everyone. I do want to make it clear that there is a growing body of research that connects vegan diets with better health. There's the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine, a DC-based organization that has been, growing this body of research that connects, shows that when people move from a standard American diet and embrace a plant-based diet, it has been very effective in ameliorating symptoms of chronic illnesses, in some cases reversing chronic illnesses, most prominently type 2 diabetes. And so for me, I do see plant-based diets as a tool to address the public health crisis that we've seen growing exponentially among African-American communities. That being said, my favorite recipe in this book is this blueberry cheesecake, which it's a vegan blueberry cheesecake, which was created by this LA-based chef, Malcolm Livingston III. And, I know that a lot of people have had negative experiences with maybe some self-righteous, dogmatic, judgmental vegans, or they've had like some pretty crappy vegan food before. And I'm always trying to help dispel the myths that, vegan food is just bland and boring and all brown. And so when I want to kind of show people that you can have vegan food and it's just as satisfying and delicious, that's one of my go-to recipes, is giving them that blueberry vegan cheesecake, and people are just blown away. So
yeah, vegan food has come so far, both in recipes and in what you can get at restaurants and the ingredients available, in good ways and bad ways. You can still be very unhealthy as a vegan.
Oh yeah, I always say that, it's not just about embracing a vegan diet, because sure, you can have a diet that avoids any animal or animal-derived products, and it could be a horrible, crappy diet replete with processed and packaged and fast food. So I always make the distinction, encourage people, if they are looking to move more in that direction, to embrace a whole foods vegan diet, to ensure that you're eating lots of, fresh fruits and vegetables and whole grains and legumes, and not just like, Oreos, because Oreos are vegan. They are, but I don't know if you're Oreos every day.
No, yeah, you need the whole foods plant-based to get the nutrition. Absolutely. Actually, someone else asked in the Q&A, is there a vegetarian recipe in the book or from your experience that you recommend to beginners to help build confidence? They're very scared of cooking because they've never been very good at it. So is there a recipe they can get in Black food, or maybe another book that sort of just like a good start to say like, hey, I did it. I think I can do this.
Give them the confidence. Yeah, that's a great question. Let me think. I mean, I don't know if that's an easy one. Let me think about that, because there's so many in here. But yeah, I do need to think about, like, cooking 101. What would make sense? Well, let me say this. There is this, it's not vegan, but what's in here that makes it non-vegan? So there's a vegetarian gumbo in here. And I'm looking at the ingredients, and I don't really even see anything that has dairy or anything, so I don't know why he just didn't call it a vegan gumbo. But this gumbo is really fantastic, and it's one of those recipes where if you could boil a pot of water, you could make this recipe, because it's essentially just chopping up a bunch of vegetables. The key is with most gumbos, if you know anything about Louisiana Creole cooking, the core, the foundation of a good gumbo is the roux, and a roux is a combination of fat and flour that adds, the kind of depth and nuttiness and the flavor, the creaminess that you want in a really delicious gumbo. So I'd say that gumbo in the Black Future chapter is a great place to start because it's delicious. It just takes a little, setting aside some time to make it. And it's one of those recipes you can easily make in bulk so that you can eat some now. You can reserve some and freeze it so that if you're, just looking for a quick weeknight meal, pull it out in the morning, it'll be melted, and then you could just warm it up for dinner.
Awesome. Yeah, I remember when I was a kid, creamed eggs on toast was the thing. And I always remembered, and when I became vegan, that was one of the things that was like, can I ever make that again? Absolutely can. Absolutely can. To kind of pivot over to stuff a bit more serious, I guess, but food is pretty serious no matter what. But someone else had a question about the chapter. They talk about Black queer food, and it has an essay on the importance of holding space. To take it one step further, holding space for people at the intersection of often marginalized communities, not just LGBTQA, but people with disabilities, mental health needs. Can you speak a bit more on creating space and welcoming communities?
I think it's about having a better awareness about all the ways that people are different. I think about differently abled people, but just different, and how we need to get out of our comfort zone and, really just be able to empathize with others who have different lived experiences. I don't know if people heard that Ryan Coogler, who is the director of, Black Panther, one of the highest grossing films in history, and Fruitvale Station, who's a native of Oakland, California. He is in Atlanta filming. I think they're working on Black Panther too. But anyway, he's down in Atlanta. Have you heard about this?
Yeah, I heard about this. Yeah.
Yeah.
He was withdrawing money. And I guess he slid a note over because he didn't want them counting it because he had to take out a large sum of money. So he was like, just go count it over there.
Mm-hmm.
And they thought it was a bank robbery, and I believe he ended up getting taken into custody, right?
Well, no, they had the one of the cops came in and,
okay.
and put him in cuffs, and they walked him out to the car, and they resolved things. But one thing that had been coming up when that incident, when people were talking about it, is the fact that it's actually very ableist to, just assume that, he's sending a note, something must be wrong, because there are people who, and the thing is, he has a speech impediment, which I'm not sure if that's the only, I think it was also about just discretion, but, you have people who might, have issues with speech or might be mute or just whatever that it's easy for us to, I think it's often challenging for us to just think about the different ways in which people move in the world. And I'm always aware of, my own kind of ableism and challenging that and pushing myself to think differently. And living in the Bay Area is a great place to do it, because so many of the disability rights that we take for granted, they started here because people fought for them. So I think it starts with oneself and really challenging these isms in ourselves. I'm always, starting from the place that I am homophobic and I'm sexist and I have my own internalized racism. You can't live in a society where these things permeate a society without taking them on. And I think, when you start from that place that it's in me somewhere, then you can actually address it and work on it. And so I always encourage people just to kind of check in and check yourself for these different ways in which you might be moving through the world. And then I think, as with everything, especially being a parent, modeling is the most powerful way for you to, help people think differently. When people see, one moving differently, I think it's often very inspiring.
Actually, someone did have a question. Do you have special vegan cookbook suggestions for children?
For children? Wow.
Yeah.
I'm gonna say no, because I haven't seen a lot of great vegan kids cookbooks, but I will, we were talking about this earlier. I did bring a couple books from my own collection that, people are looking for more plant-based cookbooks. I wanted to give a few suggestions. I love this book, Sweet Potato Soul, which was written by the chef Jenné Claiborne. She really does a lot of recipes that are inspired by African American cooking.
She started as a YouTuber, right?
Oh yeah, she's a very popular YouTuber.
Yeah.
She has a massive social media following. You can actually see a lot of her videos where she's making recipes online.
Yeah, she's great.
There's often the I think unfounded anxiety about, if I eat vegan, I'm just not going to have enough protein in my diet. And I think there's this, whatever. A lot of that is propaganda. I think that comes from the meat industry. But I think that we get a lot of adequate protein. I think it's really about, do you feel sated? Are you full? And you may need to figure out how to, ensure that you have balanced meals that leave you feeling full. That being said, Cool Beans by Joe Yonan, who is a columnist for the Washington Post. This is a book that I love, and I often have given it to people who are, just kind of dabbling with veganism, vegetarianism, and looking for really hearty recipes, because it's just full of recipes that use, legumes, pulses that are very filling and cool. I will say that and this is funny because my book that was published in 2014 is called Afro Vegan, and I don't know, like in 2019 or something, 2020, I saw I was on Amazon and this thing popped up and it was like Afro Vegan, and then I see this book and I'm like, that's not my book. And so I saw that this book called Afro Vegan was, it was going to be published by this London-based Afro-British food stylist and author. And if it would have come out in like 2015, I think I would have been mad. Like, how are you going to have a recipe named after my book? That's my book's title. But I have to say that I ordered the book, and it's such a beautiful, I just feel like it's so fresh. Like the food styling is really interesting and fresh and just unique in a way that I often don't see in American cookbooks. And I was just like, I emailed her and I was like, I love your book. It's so fresh and exciting, and I would love to figure out a way for us to work together at some point. So we've been having some conversations about some potential collaborations.
That's beautiful. You took my title and you took my heart. I love it. We had a question, not in the Q&A, but I'm seeing it here a few times. It's actually one of my questions, so I'm going to give it some favoritism. What are your thoughts, on the current trend? It's more than a trend. It's become sort of like the new way of doing fast food. All the fast food people are getting into the vegan stuff. You got the McPlant, you got the Whopper, you got all these sort of meaty fast food, unhealthy staples sort of becoming the new trend, and it's actually bringing people back. They're very popular. Panda Express, all these places are doing it. What's your opinion on this trend? Good, bad?
It's tricky. It's complicated. I think that, there are a lot of people who are eating plant-based diets who are, vegan, vegetarian, and it's hard for them to get options. And it's hard oftentimes for them to get like cheap options, right? I don't want anybody eating at these places, McDonald's, Panda Express, whatever these, multinational fast food corporations are. And I say that also understanding that it could come across as very classist, to say that, from someone who has the resources to eat whatever I want and, eat local, seasonal, sustainable every day and get all this fresh fruits and vegetables. But I think the big thing for me is that, I want people, one, cooking and eating real food, And I think this idea that, it's so expensive to eat vegan. I think, there are ways in which some things that we might buy that are vegan, or, to have a vegan diet could be expensive. I think, first of all, I think a lot of times when people say that, what they're talking about are the kind of processed and packaged foods that are marketed as vegan that you might find at these expensive corporate-owned corporate-owned supermarkets or health food stores, where they often will have you spending your whole paycheck.
Yeah.
But but I also am just really, I think it's important that we all do our part in supporting, local entrepreneurs and small businesses, and, contributing to the local economy. This idea that economists talk about, the multiplier effect, where when you spend your money, it should ideally circulate in local economies several times before going out. And when we are spending our money at these multinational food corporations and fast food restaurants, that money is going off to some Malcolm X would often talk about, when you spend your money, as he said, in a business where that man doesn't, live in that community, at the end of the day, that man takes his bag of money back to his community. And I think it's important for us to contribute to local economy, support the small artisans, support small businesses. We've seen corporations like Walmart. I have, in these, traveling the country and seeing these small towns where you have like local businesses and places where people go to get their, little markets where they go get their food, or, little corner stores or small businesses where people might sell whatever wares people need. And then you have someone like Walmart who comes in, and then they eat all the businesses up, and all these local businesses, these local entrepreneurs, these people who may have had their restaurant or business or market for generations, all of a sudden they can't stay open. So I just, more than anything, want people to just, if they can, avoid these big corporations and spend your money with your neighbors, people who people who care about you ideally, and are running businesses with integrity. And that food is just crap. It's crap. And I have to say it. I don't know if people, my friend, a good friend of mine in New York, did this experiment where she took a hamburger from McDonald's and French fries from McDonald's and put it in a jar. And this was when I was living in New York. And that thing was there, I promise you, this is no exaggeration, for like 10 years. She had it in there and it didn't decompose. It was literally intact, as if, it wasn't beautiful. It looked like, a little scrappy, but it wasn't moldy, and it didn't decompose in a way that like real food should. So I just think people got to stay away from that. There are ways of eating well and eating cheaply. I just think that we have to be creative and not just do it alone. I think we also need to build a community and find friends and family who can, go to the farmer's market or go to the store and buy things in bulk and together, and then go back and cook things in bulk and share like all these, home cooked meals that you can have throughout the week, and you can freeze some and bring it out. So there are ways of eating well that isn't going to break the bank.
Yeah. And there's even places that are sort of, not healthy food, more sort of like food of leisure, let's say, more food that you eat for pleasure, that are, that are Black-owned businesses that are independently owned. There's Vegan Mob, Compton. There's a lot of places, Black-owned businesses even, that are kind of doing their own vegan thing, that are still like fun, tasty sort of menus if you want that kind of thing. So I definitely get where you're coming from. So it's 7:32. Just want to check in. I probably can do one more. Do you have time for one more question?
I can do one more. I can do one more.
Yeah. Okay. Let's do one more question. So maybe I can combine these two questions, actually. So someone's asking about, like, where do you get your cookbook recipe inspiration from? Families or people you've researched? And someone else is asking, have you ever considered doing a video series on food and cooking? I think both of those are pretty easy to answer, and so let's just kind of take a look. I think maybe you have done some video series, maybe one-offs, right?
I mean, I do little videos. I've done like a series I did a partnership with Pinterest last month and did like several little cooking videos. And I've hosted a show. I was the host of a show on PBS back in like 2008 called The Endless Feast, where we traveled around North America, really kind of getting to the bottom of like what drives local food movements. So I have some things in the work, some projects that I hope will be rolling out in the next few years, where we'll be doing a lot, cooking and talking to people and just, you know, making some cool things happen. But in terms of inspiration, you know, I'll say that like even more than like, well, I mean, they're obvious things. Like I like to go to different restaurants and see what other chefs are making and see how that might inspire me. I read a lot of cookbooks. You know, kind of draw on history and memory and think about recipes that I've eaten growing up or, you know, throughout my world travels. But I'll say that as a creative person, I really find that, you know, more than food, or not more than, but in addition to like the kind of obvious inspirations, I just look for input in, you know, all over the place, you know, going to museums, being in nature, traveling, you know, meeting new people. And I just find that, you know, just living my life to the fullest always gives me input that eventually makes its way to my book projects.
Beautiful. Thank you, Bryant. And obviously, with my lighting situation changing, I'm about to transition to the next plane of light. So I think I'm going to end it there. And I want to thank everyone who joined us today. I want to thank Bryant for being here and sharing his experiences and his wisdom in the industry with us. Please, everybody, check out San Mateo County Libraries' upcoming author talks at we have a new URL or a new web address now, smcl.org/author talks, all one word. So we would appreciate it. Also, if you could tell us how we did with this program at smcl.org/rate this event. That's smcl.org/rate this event. And they should post it there in the chat for you as well to click that link. Have a good night, and thank you again, Bryant, and thank you, everyone. This was a wonderful evening, and have it just enjoy, make some good food, listen to some great music, everyone.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
It's been a pleasure. Good night.